America, one of the largest countries on Earth by population and area, and is rich in natural resources and human capital.
Hello, I'm Julia, and together with Alea, we are here to talk about America and its literature.
The history and development of American literature covers generations and over 4 centuries. The timeline is divided into 5 periods, each with distinct characteristic, proponent, and respective composition.
Let's start with the colonial and early national period.
In 16th, the first European settler in North America began writing about their experience. The majority of American literature was practical non-fiction written by British settlers who colonized the continent. When the United States declared independence in 1776, many new writings focused on country's future. The literary works published overseas in Great Britain had a strong influence on American poetry and literature. In the 19th century, American literature remained inspired by British literary tradition, but it developed in a new way. Between 18th and 1820, short stories and novels started to represent American society and explore the American environment in novel ways.
The period was marked by writers named John Smith who wrote histories of Virginia,
Nathaniel Ward and John Winthrop, who wrote books about religion which focused on colonial America.
Next, we have Anne Bradstreet, who published The 10 Pins Recently Sprung Up in America, which was said to be the first book of poetry written in and about America.
Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who wrote the Federalist Papers, which had a major impact on the United States political direction.
Benjamin Franklin, who wrote autobiography in which he told his American life story.
Phyllis Wheatley, an African woman imprisoned in Boston, who published the first African-American book, Poems on various subjects, religious and moral.
William Hill Brown is the one who wrote The Power of Sympathy, known as the first American novel.
Olade Ekwano, who wrote The Interesting Narrative, which was among the earliest slave narratives and powerful argument for abolishing slavery.
Next is Washington Irving, who published the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, a collection of short stories and essays including The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, which are 2 of the earliest American short stories.
James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote novels of adventure about the frontier native Wampu called The Leather-Stocking Tales.
Romanticism. Romanticism is a way of thought that values an individual's emotional experience over reason. It also shows an appreciation for nature's untamed beauty over man-made order. The second period revolves around Romanticism, the Romantic period, which ran from the year 1830 to 1870. Several different groups of writers and thinkers emerged after 1830 in New England, each studying the individual's experiences in different aspects of American society. During the 1850s, wherein the United States headed towards civil war, more masterpieces about enslaved and free African Americans were published.
There are numerous proponents to be found in this period. The first one is Edgar Allan Poe, one of the well-known writers during the Romantic period. He was prodigy who wrote The Murder in the Rue Morgue.
Next is James Russell Lowell, was one of the several who portrayed everyday life in the Northeast with comedy and dialect in verse and prose.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Oliver Wendell Holmes, the most well-known of the upper-class Brahmins, who portray America using European styles and sensibilities.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote influential essays.
Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, a narrative of his life, Alone by Walden Pond.
Margaret Fuller, the editor of The Dial, a transcendentalist magazine. The Transcendentalists developed an elaborate philosophy that saw in all of the creation a unified whole. Transcendentalist concepts include nature is the truth, nature is God, and God is nature, and be self-reliant and stand up for what you believe.
Three men writers, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, wrote and released literary works that have now become some of the most well-known pieces in American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne published short stories. The most popular among them was Young Goodman Brown. Herman Melville, one of Hawthorne's friends and neighbors, his work, Moby Dick, portrayed the climax of his early life of traveling and writing. Walt Whitman, who wrote Whitman's Leaf of Grass, which became a landmark in American poetry and epitomized the ethos of the Romantic period.
Other more Romantic period writers are William Wells Brown, who published the first Black American novel called Clodagh. He also wrote the first African American play, The Escaped.
Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Harriet E. Wilson, the first black writers to publish fiction in the United States in 1859.
Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was first published serially 1851 until 1852, credited with raising opposition in the North to slavery.
Emily Dickinson, an American poet who wrote I'm Nobody, Who Are You? Because I could not stop for that. My life had stood a loaded gun, a bird came down the walk, and safe in their alabaster chambers.
Writing became a means of self-expression for Americans after the Civil War. Most writers adopted realism as their literary movement during this time. Inspired by the 19th century, a literary movement, naturalism, also emerged during the period but was distinctly marked with an intensified form of realism. This is why the third period is then called the Realism and Naturalism period, which lasted from 1870 to 1910.
A well-known American writer who embraced realism was Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain. His most notable work is entitled The Celebrate Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, a short story that made him famous.
On the other hand, American writers who embraced naturalism are Theodore Dreiser, who wrote His Sister Carrie, the most important American naturalist novel.
Stephen Crane, who wrote Maggie, A Girl of the Street, and The Red Badge of Courage.
Frank Norris, who wrote Mock Tig, The Octopus, and The Pit.
Paul Laurence Dunbar, an African-American who wrote poetry in black dialect. Some of his works are Fossum, When the Corn Spawns Hot, We Wear the Mask, and Sympathy.
Henry James's writing features both century realism and naturalism and 20th century modernism. Some of his notable works are The American, The Portrait of a Lady, What Maisie Knew, The Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Bowl.
Advance in science and technology in Western countries rapidly intensified and brought about a sense of unprecedented progress. The devastation of World War I and the Great Depression also caused widespread suffering. This contradictory impulse can be found swirling within modernism, a movement in the arts defined first and foremost as a radical break from the past. Nevertheless, the next period, called Modernist period, is still proved to be one of the richest and most productive in American literature.
Numerous proponents led this period, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who skewered the American dream in The Great Gatsby.
Richard Wright, who exposed and attacked American racism through Native Son.
Ernest Hemingway, who articulated the disillusionment of the lost generation through his early novels, The Sun Also Rises and The Farewell to Arms.
William Carter, who led the Great Plains in Pioneers, and My Antonia.
William Faulkner, who uses stream of consciousness and other formal techniques to break from past literary practice through The Sound and the Fury.
John Steinbeck, who depicted the realistically difficult life of migrant worker in his works Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath.
T.S. Eliot, an American by birth by a British subject by choice, his fragmentary multi-voice, The Wasteland.
Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg, who evocatively describe the regions New England and the Midwest.
The Harlem Renaissance produced a rich coterie of poets. Among them are Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Alice Dunbar Nelson.
Harriet Monroe, who founded Poetry magazine in Chicago and made it the most important organ for poetry in the English-speaking world.
During the 1920s, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Marianne Moore, and E. E. Cummings expressed a spirit of revolution and experimentation through their poems.
Zora Neale Hurston, who told the story of black women, three marriages through their eyes were watching God.
The drama came to prominence for the first time in the United States in the early 20th century. Playwrights drew inspiration from European theater but created plays that were uniquely and enduringly American.
Some of these playwrights are Eugene O'Neill, the foremost American playwright of the period. His Long Day's Journey into the Night was the high point of more than 20 years of creativity that began with the Beyond the Horizon and concluded the Iceman Comet.
During the 1930s, Lillian Hellman, Clifford Odets, and Langston Hughes who wrote plays that exposed injustice in America.
In 1938, Thornton Wilder presented an influential and realistic vision of small-town America in Our Town.
Lastly, postmodernism or the contemporary period. The United States entered the Cold War in the late 1940s. A conflict with the Soviet Union shaped American literature. The 1950s and 1960s brought significant culture shifts within the United States, driven by the civil rights movement and the women's movement. By the turn of the 21st century, American literature had become a much more complex, inclusive, and became open to more Americans in the present day.
Some of the famous writers include Richard Wright, who shaped literature written by African Americans during the contemporary period. One of his works is his autobiography, Black Boy.
Ralph Ellison, writer of the 1952 novel The Invisible Man.
James Baldwin, who talked about race and sexuality. His first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, was his most accomplished and influential.
Lorraine Hansberry, the proponent of A Raisin in the Sun, a play about the effects of racism in Chicago.
Gwendolyn Brooks, the first African-American poet to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1950.
The Black Arts Movement was grounded in the tenets of Black nationalism and sought to generate a uniquely Black consciousness.
Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye, launched a writing career that would put the lives of Black women at its center. She received a Nobel Prize in 1993.
In the 1960s, Alice Walker began writing novels, poetry, and short stories that reflected her involvement in the civil rights movement.
During the post-war period, the American novels had taken several forms. Having a lasting influence on American poetry during this period, the Beat movement had been a short-lived movement in the history of the evolution and development of American literature.
Allen Ginsberg. He is the one who wrote Howl. It is a poem that pushes aside the formal, largely traditional poetic conventions in American poetry.
Among the important poets of this period are Adrienne Rich, Anne Sexton, Donald Hall, Elizabeth Bishop, James Merrill, John Berryman, Nikki Giovanni, Rita Dove, Robert Spinsky, Sylvia Plath, Tracy K. Smith, William Stanley Merwin, Yusef Komunyakaa.
In the early decades of the contemporary period, American drama was dominated by three men, namely Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, and Edward Albee. Miller's death of salesman questioned the American dream through the destruction of its main character. Meanwhile, Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof explored his character's dreams and frustrations.
Other notable American dramatists include Amiri Baraka, August Wilson, David Henry Wang, David Mamet, Entozaki Shange, Richard Greenberg, Sam Shepard, Susan Laurie Parks, Tony Kushner, Wendy Wasserstein. Now that we've learned about American literature, here is a thought to ponder. How do you think America's literature influenced our own through the years? Share us your thoughts.
Till next time, friends!